All right, thanks everyone. Yeah, so I'm Phil. I'm an Android developer at Shopify here in Toronto. And I'm here today to talk about something called Imposter Syndrome. So just out of curiosity, how many people here have heard of the term Imposter Syndrome or Imposter Phenomenon? Okay, so the first 10 minutes is me just explaining it, so feel free to tune out. The only thing I ask is you laugh at, and if I ever make a joke, just laugh. That'd be cool. So whether or not you know it by name, which most of you do, you've likely felt the impact of it. And so today we're just going to talk about, sort of just what it is, how to recognize it, and how to deal with it. Okay, so imposter syndrome, I mean, there's a lot of definitions floating around. I think this is sort of a conglomeration of a bunch of different definitions, which I think is pretty accurate. And it's essentially, it's an inability to recognize your own accomplishments despite evidence of success and high achievement. And there's a lot of words in there, and I think it can be sort of summed up a little more succinctly as this. If you have imposter syndrome, you think this. And it basically means you doubt your skills, and you generally feel like everyone at work's a lot smarter than you, and that you're an imposter, and that you don't belong. So if you're suffering from imposter syndrome, how would it typically manifest? You're going to deal with feelings of self-doubt and insecurity. You're going to tend to minimize your own successes and instead focus on things that are giving you trouble. Anytime you do have a success, you're going to attribute more to luck than your own actual skill. And there's going to be this nagging fear in the back of your head that you're going to be exposed as a fraud and humiliated beyond belief. So to sort of internalize it a little bit, picture this. So picture you're an Android developer at a successful company, and you're working on features, and you're shipping PRs, doing bug fixes, just the sort of general day-to-day thing. And then you struggle, or you hit a roadblock. And so at this point, if you were suffering from imposter syndrome, you're going to start to hear things like this in your head. You're going to say, like, I should know how to do this. This is something I should know how to do. Everyone at work is a lot smarter than me. No, every success I've had before is just luck. I can't ask that question because I'll look dumb and they'll realize how much I don't know. And this is my personal favorite. I fooled whatever company that I work for into hiring me, and I'm a total fraud. So just some facts about imposter syndrome. It was first presented in 1978 by two psychologists, Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes. My apologies if I mispronounced those names, especially if they're in the audience right now. And it was originally thought to affect only women, but subsequently it's been realized that it affects all genders. And generally speaking, it at some point, about 70% of people will experience imposter syndrome-like symptoms. And it's very common in high achievers, which I think makes sense, because if you're used to succeeding at something, especially with perhaps little effort, and then when you do struggle, it can be unsettling and you don't really know how to handle it. So looking at these numbers, it's evident that a wide variety of people in various scenarios suffer from this. So let's hear from some of them. So here's a quote from someone, and basically it says, I've written 11 books, but each time I write a book, I think, okay, everyone's going to find out that I'm a fraud and I'm not a good author. So the person who said this was Maya Angelou, who, if you're not familiar, she was an author, a poet, a civil rights activist, and someone who a lot of people around the world can use as sorts of inspiration. And this quote here is very typical of imposter syndrome, as she flat out doubts her abilities and feels that she is a fraud, and everyone's going to find out. Another story, so Neil Gaiman, who is an author, he was at an event once, and he said he was at an event with a lot of important people, I think is the way he put it, and he noticed that there was an older gentleman sort of standing off to the side, and he walks up and they start chatting, and the older gentleman says this, and he says, I look at all these people and I think, what am I doing here? They've made amazing things. All I did was just go where I was sent. And so Neil Gaiman says, yeah, you're right. But you were also the first person to land on the moon, and I think that counts for something. So, so again, this is very typical of imposter syndrome because he's minimizing his own accomplishments, and it's quite an accomplishment. I mean, if for anyone who's not familiar with the moon landing, he had to change his landing site like 3 times with about a minute left of fuel, which is, you know, pretty high stakes, obviously. And I mean, like when I do a good job of parallel parking, I'm like, you know, I recognize, you know, and he's like, this guy's landing on the moon. But yeah, just very, very typical of imposter syndrome. And I know it's a bit like, it can be a bit cheesy to talk about, you know, famous people and all that. So let's talk about someone who's maybe a little, much less famous, and that would be me. That's supposed to look like me. I got a haircut recently, so I might need to update that. But I very much suffer from imposter syndrome. I doubt my skills, and I often think that I fooled Shopify into hiring me, and they're going to find out. And I think everyone who deals with imposter syndrome kind of comes about it in a different way, and it affects them differently. And so I'm just going to take a couple minutes and just give you a bit of information about me and why imposter syndrome sort of affects me. So I'm a self-taught Android developer. Basically everything I've sort of learned about software development in terms of, you know, architecture, design, testing, everything like that, I've learned on the job. And that definitely, I've been doing Android since 2011, but it definitely adds to my feeling that I am a fraud. If you believe in personality types, I'm a ISTJ on Myers-Briggs and type 6 with Enneagram, which can sort of be summed up into those four words, which I think all very accurately describe me. And I'm also a time traveler, which sounds really cool, but I assure you that it is not. And what I mean by that is I spend a lot of time thinking about things that have happened to me in the past or things that have not yet happened and may never happen. And this comes up a lot at work where I'll tend to second guess interactions I have with coworkers or worry when submitting a pull request, worry about like, is this perfect enough? What is the feedback going to be? Have I done everything I possibly can? And not only does it provide for an unpleasant experience, it also slows me down sometimes. Okay, so now that we know what it is, how do we deal with it? So I'm just going to sort of talk about some practical solutions that I've found that have worked well for me, and hopefully, if you're suffering from this as well, they can work for you as well. And I think a good first step is to sort of compare it to fixing a bug, because that's what imposter syndrome is. It is a bug. It's a misconception of your skills and the situation that you're in. And so when solving a bug, I mean, generally speaking, the first step you try to do is be able to recognize the symptoms and then be able to reproduce it. So we obviously don't want to be able to reproduce imposter syndrome, but we want to be able to recognize the symptoms. And once we're able to recognize the symptoms, then you can, and how it manifests in you, then you can actually go ahead and figure out how to fight it. So going back to sort of looking at this quote, which I presented sort of at the beginning, there's actually quite a lot of positivity that's sort of in this quote, and it can be hard to see, especially if you are suffering from imposter syndrome. But like this, imposter syndrome is a symptom of being successful typically at a high level and achieving your goals, and because you've put in a situation where you've been successful. And it's really easy to forget this, but I think it's really important to remember that, is that you're suffering from this because you have been successful and you've achieved your goals. And it's important to remember that as we sort of move forward. So as I sort of said, you know, it's really important to learn to sort of recognize some of the symptoms, which we sort of talked about a little earlier, those feelings of self-doubt and feeling like a fraud. And putting it into words, when you experience some of these symptoms and you're able to sort of step back and say like, okay, so I'm struggling, is this real, or is this just imposter syndrome? And when you're able to sort of put it into words and name it, it can be very helpful in sort of being the first step of saying, okay, I know what this is and now I know how to deal with it. And it's also, remember that you also don't have to solve everything right away. I mean, as software developers, I think we have a tendency to try and fix bugs really quickly, especially when they're in production, because it's, you know, causing problems. And I mean, imposter syndrome is a bug, you know, in production technically, because you're alive and like doing things. But it's also important that to be able to recognize symptoms first, and just being able to recognize it is a really good first step. And so, so that's sort of a goal in itself. All right, so we're now really great at recognizing it. So what are some strategies we can use to actually fight it? A really good one is to reframe some of those negative thoughts that you have into more positive ones. And imposter syndrome comes with a lot of negativity from your inner critic, which is that little voice in your head that tells you that you stink at things. And so it can be very helpful to take those thoughts and reframe them into something that's more positive. But that can be really hard to do and see, especially if you're sort of right in the middle. So let's go through some examples to sort of see how we can do that. So if we're looking at sort of some of these examples I provided a little earlier, this is a pretty common one. You struggle, you counter something, and you think, okay, this is something that I should know how to do. Well, the truth is that nobody knows everything, and especially not in Android. Like, Android is huge, and it changes so fast that it's impossible to know everything. If you think even just in the last 2-3 years, like, we now have Kotlin, we have coroutines, we have Jetpack, like we have an architecture recommendation, and so many things that didn't exist 3-4 years ago, and so it's just impossible to know all this stuff. And I can guarantee that you probably know something about Android really well that somebody else doesn't, just because it is so big, and you've probably had to focus on something in particular that is uncommon. And so that's also good to remember, is that you know something that other people don't. And another good thing to remember is that your expectations of yourself are likely way higher than the expectations that others have of you. And if you think about it, I mean, like, would you expect someone that you work with to know everything about Android? Like, I would probably not. Like, I wouldn't, but probably not. So if you don't expect others to think that, why do you expect that of yourself? So, all right, so everyone at work is a lot smarter than me. It's really easy to feel this way, especially, for example, if you've just started at a new company, because, you know, everyone else who works there seems like they know everything because they just have a lot of context with the company and you know, their APIs and things like that you don't. I doubt very much that everyone at work is a whole lot smarter than you, but even if they were, let's just say for a second that they are, a good way to think about this is that this is a really good way to just learn from a bunch of smart people around you. And this is a good tip that came from, there was a Fragmented podcast episode about imposter syndrome, and this tip came from there, which I think is really good. When you're in this situation, if you take the thought of more developing a curious mindset and focus on learning what you don't know rather than just focusing on what you don't know, we're all Android developers. We probably all like learning things, and it probably gives us some satisfaction. And so if you focus on learning it instead, you're going to get a lot more enjoyment out of it because you're doing something you like, and you're no longer focusing on what you don't know. And that just goes out the window. And so it's a really, really easy way to sort of flip that into something more positive. Yeah, so when you get a success, or when you were hired at a new company, it was just luck. I was the only candidate, you know, like, that's the only reason I was hired. I think the truth here is that, well, what you've done is you've successfully achieved a goal, and it can be really easy to discount things that come naturally to us, and I know I do it all the time. But you're successful, and you're doing something that a lot of other people in the world can't do, especially when talking about software development. And as well, this thought of turning this into just making it all about luck can be really dangerous, because it can make it very difficult for you to accept praise. And accepting praise from coworkers or anyone really is a really good way to fight imposter syndrome, because it's direct counter evidence to what you think. And I mean, also, like, who doesn't like getting praise? I mean, everybody does. So, I can't ask this question. I'll look like a fool. Everybody asks questions. I mean, again, it can be hard to remember this, especially when you don't see people asking questions often, but really think about it. Like, take the smartest person that you know or someone that you look up to at work. Have you never seen them ask a question? Like, I guarantee you have, and everybody asks questions. And asking questions can be really good. There's a lot of really good things that come with it. So just to your coworkers, it shows a lot of enthusiasm and interest on your part and your intent that you're trying to do your job as best you can. It makes your coworkers feel good because you're coming to them for help, and it will create a bond between you and a good working relationship. It gives you satisfaction of being able to, once you get the answer you're looking for and solve the problem, you get the satisfaction of being able to solve that problem. And something to remember is when you're struggling and not asking a question, you start to actually hinder your team because your progress is slowed down, and then the stuff you're worried about that you don't belong in, becoming a fraud, starts to become true in a little way because you are actually hindering your team at this point. 1 second. And just more along the lines of sort of the theme of that everybody asks questions. Anyone who's been doing Android for a long time probably is familiar with Commonsware on Stack Overflow. It's a little hard to see, but he's actually answered 21,542 questions, which is absurd to me. That must be like every Android question ever been asked. But if you look right next to it, you also see that he's asked 114 questions. So even he asks questions. Someone who you might consider to be an expert in Android, he still asks questions. And I love this guy's response. And he just calls it out. Like, it's like, yeah, I guess even you ask questions when Commonsware asks a question. So it's quite literally everybody does ask questions. And yeah, this is a good one. So I fooled my company into hiring me, and I'm a total fraud. The truth is probably that you were the best candidate. It's a good idea here to remind yourself that companies hire the best people they can for a number of reasons, and because they want the work done at a high level, and they have to pay you, and they want to pay people to do good work. And so they're not going to hire someone who they don't typically, that they're not going to hire someone who they don't think is capable to do the job. And sort of a bit of a tip here that you can use is keep a list of sort of your achievements at work as you encounter them, or if someone gives you positive feedback at work, just keep a list of it, and then you can, when you get into this situation, when you worry about imposter syndrome or that you worried you're a fraud, you can go back to it and look at it and remind yourself that you're not, with real evidence from other people. And that's just something that can be really handy. Okay, so we've recognized imposter syndrome, we've reframed our thoughts, we've been doing all sorts of great things. So what else can we do? Well, a really good thing that you can do is you can make sure to take care of yourself. And this sort of follows a line of, if you take care of yourself, you're going to, generally speaking, be happier, which will make you more productive at work, which is going to build your confidence, which is going to lessen the symptoms of imposter syndrome. So, I mean, in that vein, I mean, this first one is easy. I mean, people have been telling me this since I was a kid. Like, sleep and physical activity are really important. And I notice this the older I get. And I notice it makes a huge difference. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago when I really started focusing on this, and it's made a big difference. Another thing you can do is prioritize. When I say prioritize you, I mean do things at work that will make you happier and more productive to the extent that you can. So things like, if your work has flexible hours and you work better and you'd like to work, say, 10:30 to 6 or 6:30 or whatever because you are not a morning person, then do that. Or if you are a morning person, come in at 7 and then leave at 3. It's just do whatever you can to make you more productive and comfortable. If you've got a big project and you're having trouble getting things done, book off time in your calendar and focus and just say, okay, no one bother me. Find a spot in your work, in your office that is comfortable for you. Maybe your desk is too quiet or it's too loud or whatever, but find an environment in your office that is good for you and work there when you can. A tip that that I use. So as I mentioned on one of the previous slides, one of the words that described me was introverted. That does not mean that I'm shy or that I'm awkward, although I definitely can be both of those things. And it doesn't mean that I don't like talking to people. What it means is that talking to people makes me tired and it drains my energy levels, whereas spending time on my own raises them and energizes me. And so what I find is if I've had, say, a bad night's sleep, or if I've had a stressful morning at work and I'm trying to figure something out and I can't do it, what I will do is I will make an effort to eat lunch on my own. I like all my coworkers and I like eating lunch with them because I like them as people. But at sometimes it's a lot better for me to just kind of go off, have lunch on my own, recharge over the, say, half an hour or whatever, and then I get back to work in the afternoon and I'm a whole lot more productive. And so, I mean, I don't do this all the time because, as I say, I like my coworkers, but it can be very good in situations where you sort of need to recharge a little bit. So practice self-compassion. This can also be tough. It's easy to be hard on yourself when you make a mistake, especially at work, because you sort of feel like you're letting your team down, that kind of thing. Again, I'd sort of say here that we're all human. Everyone makes mistakes, including at work, and we're all entitled to that level of compassion because they're mistakes. It's not something we're doing on purpose. And I mean, just think about your parents, your friends, your partner, coworkers. Like, I guarantee you've seen them all make mistakes where they do something and you're just like, really? Like, why are you doing that? That's stupid. So it's like everyone makes mistakes, and it's important to remember that, and also to sort of remember that people's expectations of you are probably, or your expectations of yourself are higher than others' expectations of you. And so it's okay to sort of, when you make a mistake, just be like, okay, it's okay. So meditation can be really helpful for people with sort of busy minds or for time travelers. For those not familiar, meditation is a practice where you start to train your mind to focus on something in particular, and with the goal of sort of creating a more calm state up here. And with a calmer mind, I think it's pretty evident that will allow you to focus on work a lot easier and make you more productive because you just have less things that you're thinking about outside of work. I have trouble maintaining. I've done meditation and I find it super helpful in a lot of situations. I have trouble sticking to it as on a regular basis, but if it's something that you haven't tried, and if you are suffering from imposter syndrome or just in general want to be calmer, I definitely recommend it. You might find it super helpful. So at this point, we've talked about sort of a few different things, and we'll just sort of finish off with some more like sort of random practical tips that I find are kind of helpful. So if you're suffering from imposter syndrome and you're feeling you're not providing value, a good way to combat that is to actually really try hard to provide value. And what I mean by that is, you're at work, get involved at work in a project that might be a bit outside your comfort zone, or volunteer to maybe lead something. Outside of work, a really good way to do this is get involved in an open source project, which I know can be really scary, especially if you feel that your work isn't all that good. But another good tip from the people at Fragmented was you can start or contributing to an open source project by just adding documentation to various projects that exist, because I guarantee the maintainers don't want to do it. And if you do it, not only are you sort of contributing to a project, because it will likely get accepted, you also spend time reading other people's code, seeing how they accomplish or how they handle certain situations, and it'll probably give you ideas that you hadn't thought of before. Getting to know your coworkers can be really helpful, and their personalities. So it's easy to misinterpret a comment that a coworker will make and take that as a negative comment when it wasn't meant that way. This can be very common in pull request reviews. I find in North America we have very flowery language that we like to use. So if you on a pull request, you'll get things like, this is great, this is great, this is great, great work. Maybe you might want to consider maybe changing this, maybe, you know? And whereas, like, that's probably, I'm very guilty of doing that. Whereas someone else might just write, change that, right? And you might at first look at that and be like, whoa, why so hostile? You know, like and that's kind of rude. But to that person, that may not be rude. That may just, they're giving you direct feedback on a pull request, which is what you're looking for, and they're being very clear about what they want. And it's not meant as a criticism. It's just meant as, hey, like, I think you should do this because it would be better for the project. So I am terrible at this. I am awful at talking to people when something's bothering me, but it is really helpful. I'm sure we all know how good it feels to vent about something when you are struggling with something. It's obviously helpful to talk to people. They can provide a new perspective on a problem that you're so ingrained with, you can't see outside what you're sort of used to seeing. They can provide a new perspective. If it's someone in a, whether it's a coworker or whoever, if they have also had experience suffering with imposter syndrome, they can provide comfort in the fact that you're not the only one dealing with this, that can also help fight it, and realizing that, like, I'm not the only one dealing with this, and it's a real thing, and I am not an imposter. So writing down when you're faced with a really negative thought, writing it down I find can be really helpful, especially when you're really caught up in imposter syndrome and your negative thought is just so absurd. But in your head, you can't really see it. But then when you write it down and you see it on a piece of paper, at least I find, I just look at it and I just start laughing, because whatever it was just so untrue. But when you're in your head, you can't see it. But when it's actually on a piece of paper in front of you, then you realize, no, this is not true. I am not the worst Android developer on earth. As I mentioned before, keeping a list of achievements can be really helpful, so that when you are struggling, you can sort of go back and refer to actual evidence of you succeeding at work. And asking for feedback can be really helpful as well. I mean, I know, again, that can be scary, especially because you think the feedback is probably going to be really negative. But I think you'd be surprised at how positive it will be. And the positive feedback that you get is really helpful in fighting imposter syndrome, because it's direct evidence to what you're thinking from someone who you work with. All right, so we've talked about a lot of stuff, and hopefully it's been helpful and that you've gotten some good tips. I think it's a good way to sort of leave on this quote here, which says, the only difference between someone who experiences imposter syndrome and someone who does not is how they respond to challenges. And I think this is really helpful, because if you are suffering from imposter syndrome, this shows that you're not different than someone else, right? Like, it's the only thing that is different is you just need to slightly rewire your brain as to how you respond to a certain situation. But it is something that you can do, and because it's not, you're no different than anyone else, and that's really helpful, and that's a good thing to remember. It's just requires a little bit of effort. So if you need some more info on this, there's a really good TED Talk about it that has has many wonderful examples, and that are articulated way better than I ever could, so check that out. There's an episode of Fragmented that talks about imposter syndrome that's quite good, and there's so much information online about this. If you just Google it, you'll get a ton of it, and most of it is really good and really helpful. So thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and I was just going to say, if anyone wants to talk about imposter syndrome, I'll be here the rest of the day. I'll be at the party tonight. Please come find me or talk to me on Twitter. Hope you enjoy the conference. And from anyone who's out of town, I hope you have some time to enjoy our wonderful city while you're here. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That was fantastic. All right, listen up, everybody. We got 4 or 5 minutes. They're not done, but they're wrapping up. So you can go for your break early. That's cool, but just be like quiet and mindful of the people next door. Or you can sit around and you can ask Phil. Do you want to take questions?
Sure.
All right, let's do it. Who has a question?
Do you still feel like an imposter?
I felt like an imposter standing up here this morning. And when I saw the speaker list for this conference, I was like, me? Really?
So you said that it's better to talk to someone about your imposter syndrome, but like if somebody were to come to me and ask my opinion on their development skills, even if I don't like it, I'm not going to say it to that person's face. So how do I accept if anyone's feedback which is positive?
That's a good question. So I guess it's a good question. If I was tasked with sort of giving, because I'm bad at giving, it would be exactly the same. I would try to give a lot of positive information. Subsequently, since I've sort of been dealing with this, I guess typically, like, I think constructive feedback's really important, and I think it's also really important to give it. I mean, it's important to be supportive and all that, but it's also important to give constructive criticism as well. But just with the caveat that, like, I always do, or if I feel that it's a bit harsh, it's a caveat which this is not a personal attack. This is just what I think would be best for the project or the team or whatever, and it might be completely different at another workplace, but at this workplace, that's sort of what I think might be a little better. That's how I've approached it, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question, but we can talk about it after. Feel free to come up and we'll talk about it.
Thank you once again, Phil.
Yeah, no